Hello friends, welcome to Simply Clouded. My name is Ashish Jain. Our today's tutorial is about Amazon Web Services config service. AWS Config provides an inventory of your AWS resources and a history of configurational changes to these resources. You can use AWS Config to define rules that evaluate these configurations for compliance. What it essentially means is AWS Config assesses, audits, and evaluates all the configurational changes that happen in your AWS infrastructure environment. You can also enforce some rules against which all the configurational changes that happen to your AWS resources should be compliant. A few examples of this are to ensure encryption in your EBS volumes, or to have a certain specific naming convention, or to have a public IP attached to your instance. You can check if these rules are compliant or not. This is a good way of enforcing certain best practices in your AWS environment. Let's get started and see how we set this up. The first step for us will be to turn on the recording and actually enable AWS Config to track all the inventory and the configurational changes related to it. The first step is to select what kind of resources should the AWS config record. I have an option of record all resources supported in this region. I'll uncheck this option and I will just keep my demo limited to EC2 instances. Now, the next step would be to create a bucket or choose a bucket where my AWS can actually save the config data which is generated. It can be the tracking files in the text form which are saved in the S3 bucket. What I'll do is I'll just select an existing S3 bucket that I created for config. You can also create a new bucket which can be across accounts. You can opt in to get notified in case of configurational changes. You can do that by using Amazon SNS topics and subscriptions. You also need a role for the config service to be able to extract information from the resources that you have specified. AWS provides a managed AWS role called AWS Config Service Link role for this purpose. You can also create a role of your own. The next step is for our demo to set up some rules against which we'll create an EC2 instance and check the compliance of that EC2 instance for that rules. Since the service name or the resource that we have selected is EC2, we will select two rules which are related to EC2. We'll select one rule as EC2 instance no public IP. What this means is this rule will be non-compliant if the public IP field is present on an EC2 instance. The second will be detailed monitoring. So we'll check if the EC2 instance has detailed monitoring enabled or not. We'll try to configure our EC2 instance in a way that one of these rules is compliant and one of these rules is non-compliant. You might also want to note that these are AWS managed rules. You also have an option in AWS config to create your own custom rules, which is an advanced part of the Amazon Web Services course. Moving on, we'll just review the changes and confirm. While this sets up my AWS config recording, I'll go to the instances and I'll try to create a new instance with the settings that I prefer. I'll go to the EC2 instance dashboard and click on Launch Instances. I'll select Amazon Linux 2 with all the default settings, except I'll disable the public IP of the instance and I will ensure that detailed monitoring is disabled. So the rule will be compliant when the public IP is disabled, but the rule will be non-compliant if the detailed monitoring is disabled. Next, 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 review and launch. So I'll just create a new key pair. And I'll just launch the new instance. Meanwhile, I'll go back to my config console and see if the recording is turned on or not. I'll click on the settings button and we need to make sure that the recording here is on. What this means is that my AWS config service is recording all the configurational changes. Another way to confirm this is by going to the S3 dashboard and actually checking if the bucket has been created and the data is being sent to the bucket or not. So if you see here, logs are being generated in the S3 bucket. I'll go back to my EC2 instance dashboard and see the status of my EC2 instance. It's in the pending state. I'm going to pause the video and wait until the EC2 instance is up and running. Welcome back, friends. So the EC2 instance is up and running and is running the basic status checks. Just to confirm, it has no public IP and the detailed monitoring is not enabled on this server. Going back to my config console, it says that my resources are being discovered and the resources are also being evaluated against my config rules. If you remember, I created two rules. One is compliant when there is no public IP on my EC2 instance, and the other is compliant if the detailed monitoring is enabled. Just to note, guys, it takes some time for the config to assess, audit, and evaluate all the configurational changes that have happened recently. So I'm going to pause the video again and wait until it comes back with the report of compliance against my rules. Welcome back after pausing the video. Now, as you see on the AWS config dashboard, I get a report that one compliant rule and there's one non-compliant rule. Let's go to the rules and see which one is compliant and which one is non-compliant. As you can see, since our instance has no public IP or the public IP option is disabled, this rule is compliant. Since if we go to the EC2 instance and see that the detailed monitoring is not enabled, this rule, which states that EC2 instance detailed monitoring should be enabled, is non-compliant. Let's make a configurational change and enable detailed monitoring. Now the detailed monitoring has been enabled. I'll go back to my rule and see if it's still non-compliant. I'm going to pause the video as this may take some time. I'm back and it took approximately 5 to 7 minutes for the rule to show compliant again. And now that you see that my EC2 instance has detailed monitoring enabled, the AWS config rule, which states if the detailed monitoring should be enabled or not, is compliant. So that was a short demo of AWS config service. Note that you can create your own custom rules when you go to rule and click on add rule, but that is a more advanced part of this course. Thank you. Thank you for your time, guys. Please like, share, and subscribe for more.